Hey, Roger.
Hey, Jay-Z.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 6 of Founder Design Thinking, where my podcast goal is to find more than 10 unicorns just like us. I'm Jay-Z, and I love taking companies from 0 to 1 and helping them get traction. Help me welcome Roger Obando, who is the CTO of Loyalsnap, a fitness tech and CRM company. Roger, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jay-Z, and thanks for having me on. I'm currently Chief Technology Officer at Loyalsnap. I've been here for a couple of years, but in reality, it's just the latest of many different entrepreneurial ventures that I've done. I founded a few companies in the past, generally always focusing on the technology side of things. But small startups, very much in the 0 to 1 time frame, as you mentioned, is where I'm most comfortable as well.
Awesome. I'm going to change our background so that it's focused more on faces. And,
Great.
I've had the unique luck of working with lots of tech leaders and CTOs who have design thinking and have that product sense. I don't think everyone's as lucky. And so I love that you took the time to be on this podcast today. Let's talk about question 1. How much impact has design thinking made for you as a founder?
Sure. I don't know if we actually covered this when you and I spoke previously, but I actually have a design degree as well. When I was in school, I've always wanted to have sort of an artistic outlet to the computer science counterpart, right? So to have something where I could go and express myself artistically as well as knock out code on a regular
I
basis.
didn't know that. You are a true unicorn because a lot of CTOs get into design thinking on the job, but you are,
Yeah.
Tried and true, like from the get-go.
Yeah, it's been my whole career, but it's also been, you know, a little dangerous because you get a degree in something and you think you know what you're talking about until you actually meet real product designers and you're like, oh, I actually don't know what I'm talking about, and I should just defer to what this person is saying. But it's come in handy to like be able to at least understand that perspective, of a designer and of wanting to deliver the best experience for the end users. As far as how it's come into play in my career, it has in so many ways. For many years, I did a lot of front end development work, working on interfaces, working on being focused on what the end user needs. But it comes into play in everything, and my entrepreneurial journey as a founder, I think one of the stories you and I were talking about was my last company that I started in the cannabis industry. It's a company called Baker Technologies, and we provided CRM solutions for the cannabis industry, right? So very much a direct, parallel to what I'm doing now for the fitness industry. And at this point, I'd already been doing what I do for close to 20 years, and you come into it thinking that you have a pretty good idea of what users need, what they want to see, but we totally just didn't take into account the fact that we were dealing with an audience in a brand new industry that had never been anything but illicit. And so the people that I was used to working with are, typically very technically sophisticated. At least the bar is a little higher than the average person from a technology perspective. And so, we set off to build a proof of concept initially, and it just didn't work. Like because of the fact that we were designing for sort of a base level understanding that was higher than what the audience actually had. And so we had to very much, leverage our customer base and ask them what they wanted and what was working and what wasn't working to come up with what was really the lowest common denominator as far as interface goes, right? And that trumped any of our own instincts and what we thought about design for the product. And we had to really adjust in order to be able to satisfy the needs of our customers.
So I think you told me a story about how, like, you gave me an example of what the users did and did not understand. So can you give us an example?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we're we're rolling out a CRM customer relationship management company for an industry that has historically been very much operated in the shadows, right? So you can imagine how difficult of a sales process it was initially to say, hey, you've been doing this trying to avoid any sort of visibility for the last 20 years. And now I'm coming knocking on your door and trying to convince you that you need to be collecting information about email addresses and phone numbers. How often are they coming in? What are these people doing? And it was just very counter to what everyone in the industry had been used to for so long. And so that really ended up impacting a lot of the language that we use, like how we refer to things in our system. I think a lot of us in technology are very used to living in a Salesforce world where like a CRM, and what the general verticals that are involved in that sort of work. But for this system that we did with Baker, it was kind of like blow that all out of the water, because you're not dealing with these individuals who are used to that, who have these are not people who are used to working with point of sale systems, that are used to working with uh, targeted marketing tool sets. These are folks that needed to be very, very simple. And so um, everything from, order placement, automating label printing for orders, to, SMS messaging, which became one of our biggest tools, because of the fact that, the cannabis industry doesn't have access to regular marketing tools. You can't use Facebook, you can't use Google, you can't use Instagram. And so, in order to engage and retain your customers, you really have to focus on direct connection to them. And so, our SMS toolset was one of those things that really allowed our customers to touch base with their end users and their consumers. And so, we ended up putting a lot of focus on that in a way that we initially probably didn't think we were going to.
Got it. So you focus more on the owned and operated channels like text and email, and you weren't. You were still in hiding from the big social networks where this was probably still on the illicit materials list.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't even hiding. They just didn't want to have anything to do with us, right? Being back in a non-regulated vertical has been so liberating to me now. Like, I can work with everybody. I can work with Salesforce. I can work with Shopify. I can work with whoever the hell I want. Stripe, Zoom, all these companies, like, they'll integrate with me. I don't think you come to understand how dependent we are as technologists on the interlacing of different service providers online, right? Like, no one writes their own email servers anymore, right? Like, no one is writing telephony functionality to actually interact with Verizon, right? You're dependent upon these third-party vendors that do these things for you. And when you're working with an industry where they're just like, I can't be seen to be doing that, and then you have to do everything on your own, you really understand that you're standing on the shoulders of giants in order to deliver, what we're able to do in a very short period of time.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that you used your design background to, first of all, find an industry that was expanding. And then, second of all, go from a very different 0 to the 1. So I think we have some people who joined us. So, anyone who's joined, please comment your questions in the chat. But Roger, what was the version 0 like? And then how did your design thinking change the version 0 into version 1?
Sure. When we first came up with the idea, CRM was nowhere on our radar. That wasn't something that we set out to do. Much like so many other startups, it's all about the pivot, right? So the idea that we had initially was that we knew that a lot of dispensaries, so this is 2014, 2015, Washington had just legalized and Colorado had just legalized. And so we were very much first to market and trying to deliver, a software solution to the problems that we thought they would have. And initially, the problems that we thought people would have was, maximizing revenue from the highest value customers. And so, because of the fact that I don't know if you remember seeing, newspaper articles from that period of time, but Washington and Colorado every dispensary that was open had lines of people at the front door, and they would often run out of product, and people would be disappointed at the end of the day. They had to come back. And after investigating the market a bit, we realized that very much so Pareto's principle is applicable to the market, and that 80% of the revenue is coming from 20% of the consumers. And there is also a direct correlation with the amount of time that those consumers needed in front of what's referred to as a bud tender, right? So someone who's going to give you recommendations. So you're looking at these lines of people and you're saying, all right, 2 out of every 10 of these people is going to spend over $300 inside, and they don't want to spend more than 2 minutes talking to a bud tender. And they're getting really frustrated because they're standing behind, these suburban housewives who are asking 17,000 questions and buying 2 joints, right? So
I
the
see.
dispensary is not winning, right? The dispensary is not winning in that case. They want to get their high value customers out, in and out the door. So we built a online reservation system. So we would sync menus, we would sync inventory from point of sale, and allow customers to reserve product, not purchase. Just wanted to stay out of the crosshairs of the federal government. But you could reserve product, which would then be waiting for you on a kind of express lane sort of situation. And that was our foot in the door. Like, people did like that product, and during that phase of the industry, it was very valuable because there was a dearth of locations in the product, and so people wanted that access. But we also started to see after a year or two that market saturation was starting to become right. Now you're moving to the second kind of phase of an industry. There's a dispensary on every corner in Denver all of a sudden, right? And the problem is no longer keeping the shelf stock. The problem is customer acquisition and customer retention, right? Because again, keeping in mind, you can't advertise on Facebook, on Instagram, on anything. So everyone was essentially just doing like printed ads with $35 off your first order, sort of thing at dispensary. And so there was zero incentive for customers to be loyal, right? Like, why would I do that? I'm just going to go to this new store and get the deal, and go to the next store and get the deal. And so that's when we first started to think about customer retention. It's like, how can we incentivize the user to stay loyal despite the fact that they might be getting a better deal down the street? So we started to play along with loyalty programs, which were very successful. And then eventually the ad tools, marketing tools, right? Specifically SMS and email. Strange, tangential bit of information about that. When, again, moving into a brand new market that hasn't been habituated with the standards of other verticals, we realized like no one was opening their emails. Like, we had built this email tool set, right? And it's just like, well, that's what you do, right? You do email digests, and you send them out to your customers, and you allow people to fill out templates with information and throw in your merge data, and boom, you're done, right? We had no engagement. We had so little engagement with emails, but
Oh,
SMS
wow.
engagement was through the roof.
Huh.
And it was like, oh, okay, so this is, it's a new industry. There's no standards. There's no like how we've always done things. And so it was able to, I think the term is leapfrog the email marketing era and go straight into like, oh no, we only care about SMS marketing, which definitely presented its own problems because of even that back then. If you think about this being 2015, TCPA compliance was still kind of this fuzzy thing, and no one
Mhm.
really, it was not as much anti-spam stuff, and so there was definitely a lot of kind of like asking for forgiveness rather than for permission sort of things when we were doing that sort of work. But everyone was doing the same thing. But yeah, it was really interesting to see like that new community coming from a very different background really forced us to change how we thought about our product.
I love that you were like a cowboy in the Wild West, like, first frontier.
Yeah.
So you could
No,
do,
I mean,
go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, like, I use that analogy all the time, right? And it's nothing new. The life cycle of an industry, right? You have your pioneer phase, right, which is exactly when we got in. And that's the wild, wild west, right? It's Oregon Trail. You're going to die of dysentery. And then you have, after that, you have your settlers phase, right? And that's where like I'm no longer kind of pushing the boundary. Now I'm kind of I found this someone's already done that. They've established it, and I'm going to help build it out a little bit. And then eventually you end up in the city planner phase, right? Which is like, okay, well now this has gotten to be a thing, and we really need to plan how do we scale this in a large way. And I love, and it sounds like you do as well, that I love the pioneer phase. I love that
Absolutely.
sort of running and gunning and just trying things and trying to see what sticks. And the industry, it's been really fun to watch. I very much stay in touch with people in the industry. I'm an advisor for several different firms in the cannabis industry, and it's definitely moved well into the settlers phase at this point. And I would argue that teetering on the city planner phase here pretty soon. Now, all that is definitely impacted by the fact that it's still federally illegal, right? But well, that's a whole other conversation around how that impacted product as well. Just because every time we rolled out in a new state, it was essentially like rolling out in a new country. Um, but hopefully, in the future, we're going to see a little more stability in the industry.
So to summarize, it seems like design thinking had many impacts. So I'm going to ask you to pick one from a list that I'm going to just throw out there. So it seems like one of the many impacts of design thinking was building your own tech stack because you couldn't utilize third-party vendors. Another was going from reservations to loyalty program. Did I miss any?
No, and then even beyond that, from the loyalty program to CRM, right? Full on actual marketing tool sets and user segmentation, things like that. No, absolutely. Those are two of the biggest things for sure. And also, though, I think, and we had talked about touching on this today. I was very fortunate in that the composition of my founding team, I think, was, and I've done this a few times now, to this point in my career, it was my favorite composition of a founding team. We had our CEO, who essentially was a fundraising machine. I mean, it was like, that's what you do. You go out, you shake hands, you kiss babies, you raise money, right? You get the rest of the team what they need in order to actually continue to move forward. And also, obviously, you tell the story and you share the lore of what you're trying to accomplish. But then we also had, so myself as a second co-founder, chief technology officer. That one's pretty, cut and dry. I've been doing this for 20 something years. I've been doing the tech thing for a long time. But then our third founder was our chief product officer. So he actually had an architecture background and had shifted into the digital space. And so he, more than anybody, really came to the table with an eye on design as a leading priority for us. Whereas I think a lot of the other companies, and if you think about what the landscape looked like in the cannabis industry during that period of time, it was very much what we like to joke as the bongs and thongs era of the cannabis industry. So just a lot of really kind of lowbrow, a lot of green, a lot of marijuana leaves everywhere. No one had done user research, or like very few people had done user research.
Mm-hmm.
No one had yet identified that the actual most desirable demographic is a suburban housewife in her mid 30s, who we eventually came to refer to as the Chardonnay mom, because she was the one who had disposable income. And what she doesn't want to see when she goes to a store is a Rasta curtain with weed leaves everywhere. She wants to go to a store that looks like an Apple store, where there's a lot of people there that she can ask a lot of questions to. And you know what? She'll pay 30% more for that product because of the fact that the environment is comfortable for her. Right. This is another thing that really came to light as we continued to grow in the industry, was that you're not convincing customers to buy another widget, right? Like, you're convincing customers to do something that they've been told for the majority of their adult lives is illegal and bad for them, right? And like, how do you provide a safe space for these individuals to come in and ask questions about, hey, I need help with my sleep, I need help with my appetite, all these other things. Or even like, listen, I'm not one to say, I never did like the cannabis red herring of like, it's all medicine. I think it is medicine for a lot of people, but some people just enjoy how it makes them feel and it helps them relax at the end of the day. And I think that's a perfectly valid reason for people to go in there and to have locations and dispensaries that were well equipped to answer the questions for those individuals and have them leave having a good experience, willing to refer a friend to that store, etc. I think that was a very big sea change in the industry from the early days where it was just like, I want to go to the place with the most weed with the best quality, right? And like that very quickly identified itself as a very small portion of the intended audience, and that there was a lot of opportunity for design and education for the rest of the community.
Oh, wow. So are you saying that in the three co-founders, one of them was a chief product officer, and he found that the persona was not the like Rasta weed guy. It was more this Chardonnay mom who had enough income to be a loyal customer. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely part of the work that he did when he was doing user persona identification. Well, him and his team. Yeah. Again, it just goes back to the fact that no one was even thinking about these things before, before folks like us who have had experience thinking about these sorts of things kind of came to the industry. I'm not saying that we were the only ones doing it. I think a lot of our contemporaries were figuring out the same things at the same time, which also really explains the um, proliferation of different brands in the space, right? Like at the end of the day, this went from very early days being an industry that was um, driven by product, quality of product, and there was a lot of variation to a point where that was almost commoditized and everyone was generating very good product. And so it became an exercise in brand differentiation. Like, who do I relate to? Right. I'm sure you've seen everyone from Jay-Z and Rihanna and all these different, celebrities have their own like associations with different cannabis brands. And all that is, who do I align with? Like, who do I want to be aligned with? Am I, more of a, who was it? Was it Sarah McLachlan who did I think she did an infused wine company up in Northern California? Or like, that's a very different product and very different demographic than you have if it's like, Rihanna's joint line, right? And so to have a product team that was able to look at the whole landscape and say, there's opportunities here and here and here and here, right? Is it a medical opportunity? Is it the suburban housewife's opportunity? And there's also, I mean, you can't deny that the historical customer from the illicit industry was always going to be there as well. And they're going to have very specific needs and desires around how they interact with your product and about what they're going to end up walking out of the store with. So taking a very product driven approach there, I think allowed us to continue to stay relevant over the time that we had Baker up and running.
I see. So the persona that you started with wasn't necessarily the only persona that you pursued. You would continue to explore others.
Yeah. I mean, I think the assumption by most of us on the team in the early days was that we were going to be catering to these kind of habitual users that are coming out of the illicit market and into the, now legal market. And in the early days, that was pretty spot on. I mean, they were the first ones who were willing to walk into a store and be like, may I please buy some marijuana? Right. But then over time, just being able to make sure that we didn't have blinders on and to see, hey, there's other people here who matter. Right. And this is something also that's really interesting in that about your own networks, right? Like, so one of the things I learned about being in that industry is I'm very willing to be very open and honest about my cannabis consumption. Like, I've been consuming cannabis since I was 18 years old. I've always been a fan of legalization efforts. I think there's a lot of medicinal appeal to it for a lot of different people, but I think at the very least, it's a whole lot healthier than alcohol is. And it's an alternative that allows people to, soothe themselves, which I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But, even and this is something even for us as founders of a tech company in cannabis, we're like, you have to be upfront about that. Like, you have to be willing to go out and tell people that, because only then will the Chardonnay moms come up to you and say, oh, hey, can you recommend a shop that I should go to? Because I heard about this vape pen and it's supposed to be very well dosed and this and that, whatever. If you're not like, people need to see someone that reminds them of themselves already in the space in order for them to get more comfortable in going into the space themselves. And so that was also a really interesting exercise over the time that we built the company. And so in a way, I kind of became a poster boy for cannabis tech and legalization and a bunch of other things.
That's really fascinating because you have to wear it on your sleeve, right? The fact that you're successful legitimizes the product as well. And so,
Yeah. And there was actually a counterpoint to that as well that I think you might find really interesting. I used to do a lot of public speaking events. I would go, and talk about marketing. I would talk about the industry. I would talk about demographics. And generally speaking, I would be going to these events, and I would be suited up, right? I'm have a blazer on at least, a shirt, your conference outfit persona person type thing, right? And depending on the crowd that I was in, I would get people in the audience. Like I remember being on stage and talking about marketing, and someone who, not to be stereotypical, but like who you would look at and be like, okay, this person has been smoking cannabis since the 60s and they dressed the part and they looked the part, right? And he stood up and he's like, do you even consume cannabis? He looked at me like, oh, you're a business shill. Look at you, the way you're dressed, right? Do you even consume cannabis? And I proudly stood up on stage. I said, every day. I was like, but what does this say about you that you're making an assumption about me that I don't consume? I'm assuming a lot of people have made assumptions about you by the way you look. So why would you turn that around on someone like me and make an assumption that I'm not there? And so that was a really interesting, there was a divide in the industry for a long time, but it took a long time. I can't say it was totally mended. I think it's still there in a lot of ways. People who've been a part of this for a long time feel like, hey, this is ours. And then, those of us who came in and saw it as a business opportunity, were definitely, looked down upon in a certain extent.
Yeah, I think for those of us who are joining late, we're talking about what the correct or best founding team makeup is. And so Roger's experiences with the CEO, who is a fundraising machine, himself a CTO with design thinking experience, and then a CPO who, has done a lot of this persona research. So in your founding team, did you become the only person who was the brand ambassador, or were you all ambassadors?
I think we were all ambassadors to a certain extent. I probably had the closest relationship with cannabis of the three of us. And so I was the one who was most willing to get up on stage and self-identify and go and do the thing, right? And just go and say like, hey, we're talking about this. And for me, there was a few motivators for that. One of them was somewhat selfish. So I am Latin American. I'm Costa Rican, and I have always had a real problem with, concern about the fact that this industry that has largely been run by people of color while it was illicit. As soon as it became legal, it was nothing but old white men at the helm of these cannabis companies.
I didn't know that.
And
okay.
Yeah. And so, I was very passionate about being a senior leader of color that was being very visible and saying, hey, this is okay for you to think about joining this industry. I wanted to be that example that they could point out and say, well, Roger did it. Look at him, and I know the pressures. I actually wrote a book about this, the pressures of culturally, et cetera, of conforming, right? And especially as someone who's, an immigrant, I'm first generation, my parents are immigrants. There's that double standard of how good you have to be, of how smart you have to be, about how you have to accomplish in order to be respected at the same level of a counterpart who doesn't have those same difficulties. And so I know there's a lot of pressure in my community from family. If you're religious, from your church, if you're, the family connection is so tight in the Latin American community that people would let what they assumed their family would think about them working in the industry, would let that get in the way of them joining. And so it was very important for me to be up there, be very open about consumption, about the industry that I'm working on, and try to convince as many people as possible to join. So I did have my ulterior motives in doing it. And also, I just really enjoyed it. I mean, I really enjoyed, being this person advocating for this industry, but also, from the point of view of someone who's been building software for, 22 years, I've seen 3 bubbles at this point. right? I mean, this is something that it's ingrained in me now. So I think that was a rare combination that was pretty impactful to a lot of audiences that I spoke with.
Awesome. Well, in terms of questions for this community of founders who design think, do you have any questions about advocacy or founding team structure?
Well, yeah, this is the age old conversation of what is the best founding team structure, right? Too many people, not enough people, right? Like I think the single founder is, while the media loves eating that up, and they love putting the Zucks and the, Evan Spiegels on blast about, you know, they check the boxes, right? Uh, didn't graduate college, started a business, wonder kid. Next thing you know, they're billionaires, right? Everyone loves telling that story. But yeah, I think most of us who are in the industry realize that that's a very, very small percentage of the people that are very successful. And so I'm curious to hear, anyone has a strong opinion about founding team composition. Like I said, I really was happy with my founding team composition at Baker. But I've been fortunate to have a very strong network of other entrepreneurs, and I've definitely heard some um, other opinions about what works best. So I'm curious to hear if anyone feels strongly about what that should look like.
Yeah, I really like that structure where the founder CEO is different than the founder CPO, because I've been uh, on both ends of where the funding is leading us to a different roadmap, but the users aren't following. So I think it's really important when the structure allows for differences in point of view to come together versus having one person who's being super pressured by investors to change the roadmap and change the user offering like every week. I think that can be kind of impossible to handle within one person.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's another reason why I really enjoyed our composition. Well, one, as we joked about, it's an odd number, right? So worst case scenario, you can always vote and there's going to be a majority vote. So that made things a lot easier than if it were 2 or 4 people. But also the fact that there was a product person and a technology person that were peered as opposed to being on different levels or one's reporting to the other meant that you had to agree on what your priorities were as a team before anything got built, right? Like product didn't get to dictate what engineering was going to do, and engineering didn't get to dictate what product was going to do. It's like, no, we have to work together in order to identify what our roadmap looks like. And that, I think, was a great system of checks and balances to make sure that we didn't skew one way or another, right? In the situation that you mentioned, where you have a single founder, and that founder happens to be a technical founder, generally speaking, you're going to see a much uglier, much more effective working tool. If it's a product driven founder, then you're going to see something that's likely going to be very pretty that doesn't work very well, right? And this system, I think, allowed us to avoid those pitfalls a little more than you would otherwise.
Awesome. Well, if anyone has differences of opinion, I really expect this group to. Please let Roger and I know what your vote is on the right founding team. And then we're going to move on to the third and last question. How do leaders create an egoless culture? That culture where the product person, the tech person are equal footing. That's rare. How do you both expect to be wrong and expect to be listened to and expect to be right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's something that's difficult. It's something that I've been focused on for a very long time. And I think there's a few things that you can do. The first thing that I will always advise to any leader is that it has to start with you. Being willing to demonstrate on a regular basis that there are things you don't know, that there are things you need to defer to people about. I think the example I always like to give people is, engineers love an acronym. And so there's often time when you're in some room, mixed company, product people, design people, engineer people, and an engineer will throw out an acronym, for whatever tech they're using. And, I guarantee half the people in the room don't know what that acronym means, right? But they're also, a lot of them might be junior. They're not willing to kind of put their hands up and say, hey, what does that mean? And so in a situation like that, I always try to make it my point to say, hey, I don't know what that means. Can you please explain it to me? Which tends to catch engineers off guard. But at the same time, like for me, I think that's a really strong indication of, don't let ego get in the way of understanding, right? Like if Roger's willing to say that, then I should be willing to put my hand up and also ask the same questions, right? And that's a very simple example of, just approaching everything from that situation, right? I think as CTO, I've been a CTO in startups now for over a decade. And in the early days, I think my assumption was that I had to have all the answers as the CTO. Like buck stops with me, which it does, in many ways. But in the early days, there was an ego-driven sort of imposter syndrome thing that said that even if you don't know the answer to this, you have to go figure it out on your own and come back and save the day with the answer to this problem. And over time, I've come to realize that, that's what your team's for. If you're just willing to be able to say, I don't know the answer to this problem. So let's all put our heads together and try to figure it out. I think that really creates an environment where people will take ownership, where people will want to be autonomous, where people will have accountability, because of the fact that you're giving them an opportunity to take that ownership and to run with it. They don't think that you're just going to claim that everything was your idea and you're the hero of the show. And so I think, it starts with that leadership, being humble, and being willing to admit when they don't know something or when they need help with something. I think beyond that, it's to create an environment where you embrace failure, right? And this is something that, and I know Google talks a lot about it. I don't know how much they actually put it into practice. But being an organization that embraces failure to where if something does go wrong, if something comes up short, if someone misses a milestone or a target, it's you create an environment where people are incentivized to share that happened as it's happening. And then afterwards, in a retrospective, be able to understand, okay, well, what led to this happening? Like why didn't we meet our targets? Why did we miss that milestone? What's going on here? And really learn from the failures, right? In the spirit of, okay, well, we learned a lot from that. We're not going to let that happen to us again in the future. I think by, again, not being an authoritative leader who, leads by fear, and being able to say, you can tell me when things aren't working, right? You can tell me when, and this, I think it's so nice to see a shift in business at large now to where, companies are embracing things like mental health days. Like I'm having a really rough day today. I need to step away. It's something that we do a lot of at Loyalsnap, and I'm very, very proud of that. The fact that we really try to support our people, and not burn them out. Like, I think that's one way in which you can show people it's like, hey, listen, if you don't have it today, you don't have it today. Like, that's okay. Take your time. But then carrying that over into, how are things being designed? How are things being implemented? What are assumptions that we're making? Are we right? Are we wrong? If we're wrong, great. Let's have a discussion, right? Let's all share in the learning of that, because as soon as you take shame away from the failure, then people are willing to share, right? They're willing to share what happened. But if there's shame associated with that failure, they want to keep it to themselves as long as possible because they don't want to be they don't want to be seen to have been the ones who messed up.
Yeah, I'm going to show our banner because if people have questions about how to create this culture, I encourage you to get in touch with Roger. And I have a question before we end, Roger. So why is there so much ego in tech?
I've got my theories. I think that the media stokes the flame of, I'm going to catch a lot of grief for this one, but like the Steve Jobs, founder persona. Everyone loves to put Steve Jobs on a pedestal. And I'm the first to admit that he led the charge on many incredible products and services over the course of his career, but I never would have wanted to work for him. I mean, everything I've read about the guy, everything that I've heard about the guy, just I feel like he would have been intolerable, right? But that's the ideal from a media perspective, right? You have to be that person who is so driven, who's so opinionated, who's so this, who's so that, that people see that. People who want to be entrepreneurs will see that and they go, well, I guess I must have to be like that person if I want to be successful, right? And I think that's a big issue. I think that technology, in the big scheme of things, the rise of technology is a blink of an eye, right? I mean, when I graduated from Duke in 2000, my graduating class of computer science majors was 30 people. And I think last year it was the largest department by graduate. It was like 500 and something people, right? So just to show how much of a shift there's been in the last 22 years, it's kind of incredible. And so I think there's definitely this adoration and like, kind of societal respect that has come very quickly for people who work in the space, that it can inflate egos, right? People can think that they're important. They can think that they're special, and I think time and experience and failure really takes that out of you. After a while, you're like, I'm no special than anybody else, right? You're just, and time and experience just kill the ego. They really do in my mind, with the exceptions, I guess, of a Steve Jobs, because apparently he went to the grave with plenty of ego. But yeah, I mean, I think that those are a couple of things that contribute to it. And as more and more people, one thing that I love seeing right now, I think especially during the pandemic, a lot of people who weren't in tech all of a sudden were like, well, I'm stuck at home. I'm going to take a code academy class. I'm going to take a product management class. I'm going to do this. And all of a sudden we have a workforce of people with a very different background, right? Who didn't kind of come up through the same way. My entire team, I have a team of 6 engineers, including myself. Only 2 of us have CS degrees. It's a very big shift in what it was even 10 or 15 years ago. So I see good things coming. I love to see that there's more diversity in the industry. I think historically there was a lot of that missing in the space. We're seeing a lot more women come and join the space, especially as engineers, which I love to see that. We're seeing more people of color come into this space. And I think all of that will help to hopefully tamp down the issues around ego. I don't know what we can do about the media piece, though. I think that one's going to be that way for some time.
Well, you're standing up as a brand advocate, so that's number one. And I'm curious what you think the bottom line value is. So from your product perspective, I think egolessness and design thinking allows us to ride consumer trends and pivot with them instead of like continuing to build the same idea that someone had last year. We're going to build the idea that users are actually going to use.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what is the bottom line impact of egolessness? Is it saving, time training a developer? Is it pointing them to build an MVP?
It's efficiency in all sorts of ways, right? And that's something that when I joined Loyalsnap, I'm the second CTO, taking over for the founding CTO, right? So he did the 0 to 1 work, and then I was brought in to be like, okay, well, now we need to scale this a little bit. We need to be able to make it more reliable. And so I came in kind of really with an eye on changing a lot of things in the way that they had been done. But I didn't come at it from a place of like, hey, this is the wrong way to do things. We got to go do things this way. It was more so of like, hey, what have we been thinking about doing? What's breaking? How do we adjust and how do we move forward? Understanding that, and every team member had a lot of ideas that maybe had not been heard by previous leadership, and they were great ideas. And what I told them was, when I first joined, my CEO was like, I know you think you might want to hire some more. Let's talk about that. And I said, no, that's exactly the opposite of what I want to do. I want to take the team that we have right now that has all the tribal knowledge around this product that's been around for years. And I want to make them as efficient as possible. I want to eliminate roadblocks. I want to eliminate shiny objects. I want to eliminate unnecessary meetings. I want to, like, anything that we can do to just let this team sit and focus and become as effective as possible. That's what I want to do. And only then, once we've gotten to a point where we say we can't squeeze another ounce of productivity out of the team that we've got, and now we have a product team that's set up, that has a long roadmap that they want to see done. Because that's the other thing that was missing when I first joined. No real product team to speak of. We're still putting that together now. Like, I need to be able to see a product roadmap that has been built intentionally based on data with a sprinkling of intuition, and for that product team to be able to communicate that effectively back to engineering, and to a place where we're like, there's all these exciting things that we really want to do. I need to hire more people. Like, that's the only point in time at which I want to start expanding the team. I've got pretty strong opinions about how growing an engineering team, you actually end up losing a lot of productivity past a certain number of people. And so I want to try to avoid that as much as possible. I was also I was very fortunate. I did a brief stint at Amazon Web Services after I sold my last company, before I started at Loyalsnap, where I was a principal solutions architect for the startups group. Which essentially just meant I'm like a cloud Sherpa, right? Like, I get to work with a lot of big customers and explain to them how to best leverage the different products and services that AWS has. And I worked with them for over a decade now, so I was pretty familiar with the platform already. Learned a lot more while I was there. I was working with these companies that were getting to billion-dollar valuations with 5-person engineering teams.
Yeah. Right
yeah.
on.
And I was like, wow, I had 25 engineers at my last company and we were nowhere near this big. And so it really made me reevaluate what is important in a team of engineers specifically. And so, coming back to your question, like, what is it, egoless? And again, I had to readjust what I thought was right. Like, I used to think butts and seats was a good approach. I used to think you get numbers in, you can do more stuff. But over time and through failure and adjustment, I realized that's probably not the case. That really there's a middle ground of the right talent in the right combination with the elimination of roadblocks that is way more effective than any room full of engineers could ever be. And so if it wasn't for the fact, like, I think a lot of people really want to stick to their guns on how they think things should be done. And that's where the real problems start, right? Because the worst thing I tell my team all the time, it's like, the worst thing we could do is hire another 3 engineers, like adding 50% to our team size, and then not invest in the product team, so that we're just working on whatever product they're feeding us. And we realize that we've gone 1,000 miles in the wrong direction. That we've just been wasting resources on this feature that wasn't vetted out, that wasn't researched, that wasn't, confirmed by our customer base what they wanted. And like, I just never want to find myself in a situation like that, where I have all this firepower and I just don't know how to effectively use it. And so keeping the ego at bay and really trying to understand what the customer needs are, I think, is a great way to get there.
Awesome. Well, just to recap then, we've talked about egolessness, how it increases efficiency and velocity. We've talked about being a brand advocate in the founding team structure. We talked about user recalibrations, from Rasta Guy to Chardonnay Mom. Anything you want to end on, or last words?
No, I mean, I think maybe last words would be that over the course of my career, I've really come to respect product and design people as an instrumental key to being successful in this industry. I think as a CS guy, as someone who spent years thinking about and developing software, in the earlier days, I would have said that that's what matters most, right? Is having a good engineering team. And over time, again, maybe this is just getting older and losing some of the ego. I've come to realize that a good engineering team without a good product team is useless. That a good product team and engineering team without a good sales team is useless. And all 3 of those teams without a good account management team is useless, right? Like, there's so many things that have to work together that are all equally important. And so that's one of the reasons why I love getting an opportunity to talk about product and design, because it really is something that's hugely important to me and something that I love to hear more about and get other people's points of view on.
Awesome. Well, if anyone has questions for Roger or I on how to establish teams like this, how to establish, billion-dollar companies with only 5 engineers, please reach out. And thank you so much, Roger, for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Jay-Z. It's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.